Chapter 1. A Bond Beyond Sight. Jane sat by the window, her fingers tracing the edges of the Braille book she had been reading. The soft hum of the city outside was a constant reminder of the world she could no longer see. But Jane had learned to adapt. Her other senses had sharpened over the years, and she had built a life of independence, one step at a time. The sound of paws padding across the wooden floor brought a smile to her face. "Pluto," she called softly, her voice filled with affection. The large golden retriever trotted over to her, his tail wagging gently. Pluto was more than just a guide dog. He was her companion, her confidant, and her protector. Jane reached out, her fingers brushing against Pluto's soft fur. "Good boy," she murmured, scratching him behind the ears. Pluto leaned into her touch, his warm presence a constant source of comfort. He had been with her for 3 years now, and in that time, he had become an integral part of her life. But lately, Jane had noticed something unusual. Small items around the house seemed to go missing. A silver bracelet, a set of keys, a jar of coins she kept on the kitchen counter. At first, she thought she had simply misplaced them. But as the days went by, she began to suspect that something was amiss. "Pluto," Jane said one evening, her voice tinged with worry. "Do you think someone's been coming into the house?" Pluto tilted his head, his ears perking up. He let out a soft whine, as if trying to tell her something. Jane sighed, running her fingers through his fur. "I wish you could talk," she said, with a small laugh. "You'd tell me what's going on, wouldn't you?" Pluto nuzzled her hand, his way of reassuring her. Jane smiled, but the unease lingered in the back of her mind. She decided to keep a closer eye on her belongings, though she knew it wouldn't be easy. Without her sight, she relied heavily on her memory and her sense of touch. But Pluto was always by her side, and she trusted him to keep her safe. That night, as Jane lay in bed, she heard a faint noise coming from the living room. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Pluto," she whispered. The dog was already on his feet, his body tense. He let out a low growl, his ears twitching as he listened. Jane reached for her cane, her mind racing. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, but she could hear the faint sound of footsteps retreating. Pluto barked once, a sharp warning sound, and then the house fell silent. Jane's hands shook as she clutched her cane. "Pluto, stay close," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. The dog pressed against her side, his presence a reassuring anchor. Together, they made their way to the living room, but by the time they got there, the intruder was gone. Jane sank into a chair, her mind racing. Someone had been in her house, and they had taken something again. She could feel it, but who? And why? She reached out for Pluto, her fingers finding his warm fur. "We'll figure this out, boy," she said softly. "Together." Pluto let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew something was wrong, and he was determined to protect Jane. But the intruder was clever, and Pluto would need to be even cleverer to catch him. Chapter 2. The Thief's Game. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Jane tried to go about her daily routine, but the thought of someone invading her home weighed heavily on her mind. She began to double-check the locks on her doors and windows, and she kept Pluto close at all times. Pluto, for his part, was on high alert. His sharp senses picked up on every sound, every movement. He could smell the intruder's scent lingering in the house, a faint but unmistakable trace of cologne and sweat. It was a scent he would never forget. One evening, as Jane sat in the kitchen preparing dinner, Pluto's ears perked up. He heard the faint creak of the back door opening. followed by the soft sound of footsteps. The intruder was back. Pluto's body tensed, his eyes fixed on the doorway. He let out a low growl, warning the intruder to stay away. But the man was undeterred. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes darting around as he searched for something to steal. Jane froze, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The intruder didn't respond, but Pluto's growl grew louder. The dog stepped forward, his teeth bared, ready to protect Jane at all costs. The intruder hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Pluto. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small treat, holding it out to the dog. "Here, boy," he said in a low voice. "Take it." Pluto sniffed the treat, his nose twitching. It smelled delicious, but he knew better than to accept food from a stranger. He let out a sharp bark, his eyes never leaving the intruder's face. The man cursed under his breath, tossing the treat to the ground. "Stupid dog," he muttered, turning to leave. But Pluto wasn't about to let him go that easily. He lunged forward, his teeth snapping at the man's leg. The intruder yelped in surprise, stumbling back. He kicked out at Pluto, but the dog dodged the blow, his movements quick and agile. Jane heard the commotion and reached for her cane, her mind racing. "Pluto, what's happening?" she cried. Pluto barked again, his voice filled with urgency. He wanted to tell Jane what was happening, to warn her about the intruder, but how could he make her understand? The intruder took advantage of the chaos, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. Pluto chased after him, but the man was too fast. He vanished into the shadows, leaving Pluto frustrated and angry. Jane stumbled into the kitchen, her cane tapping against the floor. "Pluto," she called, her voice filled with worry. The dog trotted back to her side, his tail wagging slowly. He nuzzled her hand, trying to reassure her. "What happened, boy?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. "Was someone here?" Pluto let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with concern. He wanted to tell Jane everything, to explain what had happened, but he couldn't. All he could do was stay by her side and protect her. Jane sank into a chair, her mind racing. She knew now that someone was targeting her, and they were getting bolder. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. Pluto was with her, and together they would find a way to stop the intruder. Chapter 3. The Bribe. The days that followed were tense and unsettling. Jane could feel the weight of the intruder's presence hanging over her like a dark cloud. She tried to stay strong, but the constant fear was wearing her down. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. Pluto, too, was on edge. He could sense Jane's anxiety, and it only fueled his determination to protect her. He spent his days patrolling the house, his ears perked and his nose twitching as he searched for any sign of the intruder. One afternoon, as Jane sat in the living room, listening to the radio, Pluto's ears perked up. He heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, followed by the creak of the back door. The intruder was back. Pluto's body tensed, his eyes fixed on the doorway. He let out a low growl, warning the man to stay away. But the intruder was undeterred. He stepped into the house, his eyes darting around as he searched for something to steal. This time, the man was prepared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of exotic treats, holding them out to Pluto. "Here, boy," he said in a low voice. "Take them. They're all yours." Pluto sniffed the treats, his nose twitching. They smelled delicious, but he knew better than to accept food from a stranger. He let out a sharp bark, his eyes never leaving the intruder's face. The man cursed under his breath, tossing the treats to the ground. "Stupid dog," he muttered, turning to leave. But Pluto wasn't about to let him go that easily. He lunged forward, his teeth snapping at the man's leg. The intruder yelped in surprise, stumbling back. He kicked out at Pluto, but the dog dodged the blow, his movements quick and agile. Jane heard the commotion and reached for her cane, her mind racing. "Pluto, what's happening?" she cried. Pluto barked again, his voice filled with urgency. He wanted to tell Jane what was happening, to warn her about the intruder. But how could he make her understand? The intruder took advantage of the chaos, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. Pluto chased after him, but the man was too fast. He vanished into the shadows, leaving Pluto frustrated and angry. Jane stumbled into the kitchen, her cane tapping against the floor. "Pluto," she called, her voice filled with worry. The dog trotted back to her side, his tail wagging slowly. He nuzzled her hand, trying to reassure her. "What happened, boy?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. "Was someone here?" Pluto let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with concern. He wanted to tell Jane everything, to explain what had happened. But he couldn't. All he could do was stay by her side and protect her. Jane sank into a chair, her mind racing. She knew now that someone was targeting her, and they were getting bolder. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. Pluto was with her, and together they would find a way to stop the intruder. Chapter 4. A clever plan. Jane sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of a cup of tea. The events of the past few days had left her feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. She knew she needed to do something, but she wasn't sure what. Pluto lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He could sense Jane's distress, and it only fueled his determination to protect her. He knew the intruder would be back, and he was ready. As Jane sipped her tea, an idea began to form in her mind. She couldn't see the intruder, but Pluto could. If she could find a way to communicate with Pluto, maybe they could catch the thief together. "Pluto," Jane said softly, setting her cup down. The dog looked up at her, his ears perked. "I need your help, boy. We need to catch this intruder, but I can't do it alone. Do you understand?" Pluto let out a soft whine, his tail wagging slowly. He understood more than Jane realized. He knew what needed to be done, and he was ready to do it. Jane reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the buttons. She called her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, and explained the situation. "I need your help," she said. "Can you come over and keep an eye on the house while I'm out?" Mrs. Thompson agreed, and within minutes, she was at Jane's door. Jane explained her plan, and Mrs. Thompson nodded in understanding. "We'll catch him," she said firmly. That evening, Jane and Mrs. Thompson set their plan into motion. Jane pretended to leave the house, while Mrs. Thompson hid in the living room with a camera. Pluto stayed by Jane's side, his eyes fixed on the door. As the hours passed, the tension in the house grew. Pluto's ears perked up at every sound, his body tense with anticipation. He knew the intruder would be back, and he was ready. Finally, just as the sun was setting, Pluto heard the faint sound of footsteps outside. He let out a low growl, warning the intruder to stay away. But the man was undeterred. He stepped into the house, his eyes darting around as he searched for something to steal. This time, Pluto didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his teeth snapping at the man's leg. The intruder yelped in surprise, stumbling back. He kicked out at Pluto, but the dog dodged the blow, his movements quick and agile. Mrs. Thompson emerged from her hiding place, the camera in her hands. "Got you!" she shouted, snapping a photo of the intruder. The man's eyes widened in shock, and he turned to flee. But Pluto was faster. He chased after the intruder, his teeth snapping at the man's heels. The man stumbled and fell, crashing to the ground. Pluto stood over him, his teeth bared, ready to protect Jane at all costs. Jane rushed into the room, her cane tapping against the floor. "Pluto," she called, her voice filled with relief. The dog trotted back to her side, his tail wagging slowly. He nuzzled her hand, trying to reassure her. Mrs. Thompson called the police, and within minutes, the intruder was in handcuffs. Jane sank into a chair, her mind racing. It was over. The intruder had been caught, and she was safe. Pluto lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He had done his job, and he had done it well. Jane reached down, her fingers brushing against his soft fur. "Thank you, Pluto," she said softly. "You're my hero." Pluto let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with love and loyalty. He had protected Jane, just as he had always promised to do. And in that moment, Jane knew that she would never be alone as long as Pluto was by her side. Chapter 5: Justice Served. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The police arrived at Jane's house, taking statements and gathering evidence. The intruder, a man named Greg, who lived just a few houses down, was arrested and charged with burglary. Jane couldn't believe it. Greg had been her neighbor for years, and she had never suspected him. But the evidence was clear, and Greg confessed to the crimes. He had been stealing from Jane for months, taking advantage of her blindness. As the news spread, the community rallied around Jane. Neighbors she had never spoken to before came by to offer their support and condolences. Jane was overwhelmed by their kindness, but she knew she couldn't have done it without Pluto. The dog had become a local hero, his bravery and loyalty inspiring everyone who heard the story. Jane was proud of him, and she made sure he knew it. She showered him with treats and affection, thanking him for everything he had done. But despite the relief of catching the intruder, Jane couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had always felt safe in her home, but now that sense of security was gone. She knew she needed to take steps to protect herself, but she wasn't sure where to start. Pluto, as always, was by her side. He could sense Jane's anxiety, and he did everything he could to reassure her. He stayed close, his warm presence a constant source of comfort. One evening, as Jane sat in the living room, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated, her heart pounding. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. "It's me, Mrs. Thompson," came the reply. Jane let out a sigh of relief, opening the door to let her neighbor in. Mrs. Thompson had brought over a casserole, and the two women sat down to eat. As they talked, Jane found herself opening up about her fears and anxieties. Mrs. Thompson listened patiently, offering words of comfort and advice. "You're not alone, Jane," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "We're all here for you, and you've got Pluto. He's a special dog, and he'll always protect you." Jane smiled, her fingers brushing against Pluto's fur. "I know," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without him." As the evening wore on, Jane felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Pluto, and she had her community. Together, they would get through this. Chapter 6: A New Beginning. The weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal for Jane and Pluto. The fear and anxiety that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by a sense of security and peace. Jane took steps to protect herself, installing a security system and getting to know her neighbors better. She even joined a local support group for blind individuals, where she found comfort and camaraderie. But through it all, Pluto remained her constant companion. The dog's loyalty and bravery had not only saved her from the intruder, but had also given her the strength to move forward. One sunny afternoon, Jane and Pluto went for a walk in the park. The air was warm, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Jane felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. As they walked, Jane thought about everything they had been through: the fear, the uncertainty, the triumph. It had been a difficult journey, but it had also brought her and Pluto closer together. "You're my hero, Pluto," Jane said softly, her fingers brushing against his fur. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Pluto let out a soft whine, his tail wagging slowly. He looked up at Jane, his eyes filled with love and loyalty. He had done his job, and he had done it well. As they continued their walk, Jane felt a sense of hope and optimism for the future. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she could face them with Pluto by her side. Together, they had overcome the darkness, and now they were ready to embrace the light. Jane smiled, her heart filled with gratitude for the loyal dog who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. And as they walked into the sunset, Jane knew that no matter what the future held, she and Pluto would face it